Hello, everyone. Wonderful to see a packed house. Dr. Ramakrishnan has just arrived from London this morning. I'm looking forward very much to this conversation. I think we have 45 minutes. The plan is to do 30 minutes of this discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience for the final 15 minutes. For those of you who haven't read Why We Die, this is a fabulous, very fascinating book. Of course, there's a lot of science in it, but there's also a lot of human beings, there's a lot of stories about people involved in science, and there's a lot of wonderful analogies. I'll begin with a slightly naughty line that somebody in the book, one of the characters you mention in the book, says. He says that your IQ halves every year that you're in aging research. And I thought it was quite fascinating that, at one point, aging, longevity, these were considered things that...
By the way, that guy won the Nobel Prize this year.
Oh, there you go. Was it for aging?
But not for aging. He won it for his discovery of microRNAs.
Okay.
Which is what his field was, as I mentioned.
Got it. So clearly aging was viewed with a certain kind of disdain. So I was very curious to know, Dr. Ramakrishnan, why you, an established scientist, wrote this book called Why We Die.
Yeah, so first of all, my field is somewhat related to aging because one reason for aging is the way we make proteins and the control over that synthesis of proteins breaks down with age, and our ability to deal with misfolded or dysfunctional proteins also declines with age. So my own field has a central role. Of course, aging involves many things, but I don't work on aging myself. But the reason to write it really is because it's a big existential question. I think humans are perhaps the only species that knows about mortality. Other species know about death. For example, elephants know when an elephant in their herd has died, but they don't know that there's an expiration date, that they're all going to die and their lifespan will be no more than such and so on. But humans discovered that at some point, and ever since then, we have been obsessed about not dying. So the way we've dealt with it is different. For example, some religions believe that if you bury the body, then the body will come up alive on Judgment Day. These are the Abrahamic religions. And Eastern religions like Hinduism or Buddhism believe that when you die, it's okay, your body dies, but you have an immortal soul. So these are all ways of viewing death not as a finality, but as a transition. And so it's bothered us, but for most of our existence, there was nothing we could do about it, and so it was just something you had to either deal with or ways of, cope with it in various ways. But in the last 50 years or so, science has advanced so that people are really coming to understand about the biology of aging. Why is it that we age? Why is it some species live very short lives, other species live very long lives? And that then means you might be able to do something about it. You might be able to slow down the processes of aging. And coupled with that, in many countries, there's an increase in longevity and a dramatic drop in fertility, with the result that populations are getting older. India is not at that stage yet, but according to projections, it's going to be in that stage in a few decades. And so all countries are worried about having an aging population that requires extensive care. So they want to make sure that you can do something about health in old age. And that's another reason to study aging. And the final reason is this has attracted a huge amount of money in the field. There's 700 companies with many tens of billions of dollars invested in longevity research. And it's also attracted a number of billionaires who clearly don't want to die because they like their lives a lot. Most of them are from California, I should say. And so that is also distorting the field, and the field is full of hype. I'm sure even in India, if you read newspapers, every couple of weeks there'll be some article about some breakthrough in aging, and you do this and you'll live longer, etc. And I was irritated by all this hype in the field. And so I thought it would be good for somebody who's reasonably close to the field but not in the field to write an objective book. So that's a sort of long answer, but it had a few different aspects to it.
I wonder, you do mention in the book somewhere that until very recently, about a century ago, death was all around us, in the sense that, if couples had 8 children, there were chances that half those children would even die. Today, on the other hand, death is much more sort of compartmentalized. People die in old age homes, they live longer, so we're not that used to seeing death almost on an everyday basis.
Yeah.
Does that somehow trigger this great anxiety about death?
No, I think people have always been anxious about death. You look at the first emperor of China named Qin, after whom China is named, by the way. He unified all these kingdoms in China. And he was obsessed about death. And he used to take all sorts of compounds, many of which were toxic, and which probably killed him off because he died in his 40s, And then he built this huge mausoleum with all these terracotta warriors in Xi'an, thinking that, if he somehow resurrects himself, he'll have all these things around him. So I think people have always been obsessed about it.
But how old was he when he actually died? This emperor, how old was he when he actually died after taking all
in
of
his
these?
40s.
Didn't work.
Yeah, so he probably killed himself off because of his obsession with taking all these. Many of them were probably mercury compounds, which were toxic. And then, of course, my book starts off with the pharaohs in Egypt, who were that's also, in fact, you could think of the whole thing as a death denial exercise. You mummify the corpse, and you then entomb it in this fancy tomb in the pyramids. And the idea is that they will one day come alive and be put to some test. So I think that obsession's been around a long time. It's just the obsession has become more science-driven and technologically driven now.
It reminds me also of a story of a sultan in India, in Gujarat. They say that his mother his name was Mahmud Begada, this is an actual historical figure, and they say that his mother, from the time he was a toddler, microdosed him with poison so that nobody would be able to poison him to death, so he'd be able to live out his full span. And apparently by the end of it, he himself turned poisonous, so if he spat on people, they would die. If he spent a night in bed with his wives, they wouldn't wake up the next morning. These are just stories, but your China story...
I'm not sure that's a true story.
Exactly. It's one of those things that Europeans concocted. Now, coming to the biology in the book, at the back cover of the book, you ask this question. Although we might not like it, does death serve a necessary biological purpose? Now again, religions, everything that human society constructs around life itself, forget death, even life, we are taught to think that we are here with some purpose. Life has some purpose, right?
Yeah.
But you essentially make the point in the book that the primary purpose of life is purely biological, and that is what determines normally how long we live, how long different species live.
I think, even biologists outside the aging research field misunderstand the evolutionary basis of longevity. In fact, when I started writing this book, I had a number of incorrect ideas. I thought maybe this was an evolutionary scheme to ensure regeneration, because every generation you recombine genes and you give new combinations of genes a chance. But actually that isn't true. That kind of idea is what evolutionary biologists call group selection, which is that you have something that benefits the group rather than the individual. But evolution doesn't work that way. It only acts on groups if the groups are all essentially clones, like bees in a hive, or insects, like ants, in a colony. But for species like humans, it acts on the individual because it's the individuals that carry our genes, and it's the genes that are selected for. So the short answer is that evolution doesn't care how long you live. It only cares about something called fitness, which is how likely is it that you're going to successfully propagate your genes, that your genes will be around to be selected for. And so the equation is different for different species. So if you look at different species, the longevity ranges. For example, an insect called the mayfly only exists for a day, and butterflies typically live for a few weeks. At the other end, you have species that live for several hundred years, like the Greenland shark is known to live for over 400 years, and it's a vertebrate. And so, what causes this difference in species? Well, every species has to allocate resources, and resources are not easy to get. As before we were agricultural, food itself was very hard to get. And so you have to decide how you allocate your resources. Do you allocate them for growth and reproduction, or do you allocate them for maintenance and repair? So maintenance and repair will allow the body to live longer. That may be a benefit because it gives you more time to reproduce. On the other hand, if you're a small animal like a mouse, there's no point in having a mouse that lives 40 years because long before that, it's going to be killed by a predator, or it's going to starve to death or die in a drought or a flood or something. And so in a mouse, for example, evolution has chosen to maximize growth rate and rapid maturation and fertility. So the mouse can have lots of offspring very quickly before it dies, and therefore pass on its genes. Whereas with larger animals, the equation is somewhat different. And the longer you live, the more chance you have of finding a mate, and you have a longer term to nurture it. And also larger animals have slower metabolism. So it takes them a longer time to mature, but also a longer time to age and die. So you can see how this idea of evolutionary biology explains why there would be a big difference in lifespan. And one final point is that evolution will often choose things that help you early in life so that you can get to adulthood and reproduce, even if they cause you problems later in life. So many mechanisms that may prevent cancer early in life, for example, switching off your telomerase, which keeps your chromosomes stay long and prevents them from shortening, that's a cancer risk. And so you wouldn't want most of your cells to have that. But at the same time, that causes senescence and aging later in life. And this theme plays over and over again in different parts of biology. You can see how things which benefit you early but cause you to age later are still selected for.
It's quite fascinating, this whole business of trade-offs, because in the book you also highlight animals ranging from worms to other animals, which in some cases are able to delay death, in some cases they're able to pause even the process of living. That worm, for example, can pause its life.
Yes, the pausing is it's a different thing, because they're not actually doing anything. They're all their biological processes have slowed down, and they're in this inert state. That's what you're talking about. But what people have done is explore the span of worms. Now, does this mean that you could introduce this gene in humans and double your lifespan? Well, not necessarily. In fact, mutants, in those same mutations in humans have some pretty horrible phenotypes. And so all of these mutations have trade-offs. Now, in worms, they don't seem to matter quite as much, but even in worms, if you take those mutant long-lived worms and put them in a petri dish with a colony of wild-type worms, the wild-type worms will quickly outcompete them, and eventually there'll be no mutants left, which means they carry a fitness cost. So there's something about these mutations that affects your ability to compete early in life. So there's no free lunch. And I think what the aging people would like to do is they'd say, well, we'll preserve a wild-type phenotype early in life, and then we'll give you some sort of drug that mimics some of these effects of these mutations later in life. So you get through the early part normally, and then you slow down aging after you've matured. So that is a strategy that some people are hopeful might work.
On this whole business of mutation, it's Another thing I loved about the book is how it sort of really looks at the cell. Even as a school student, I obviously knew that the cell was a very complicated affair, but this, you've actually made it very accessible. You talk about how there are cells and they have their own garbage disposal system, they have their sentinels, there's the way the protein is folded, that can cause its own issues. All of that, cells can commit suicide. So the cell really is, in many ways, is a microcosm of all of this. We think of ourselves, but it's really happening at that level.
Well, the cell, was discovered, I think, in the 1600s. And ever since then, has been thought of as the unit of life, in the way that physicists would regard elementary particles or even atoms or chemists would regard atoms as the unit of matter. But I think, aging occurs at all levels, from molecules which exist inside cells, so there are thousands of molecules in each cell. Molecules themselves age. They show changes, they show damage, they show loss of function with age. And those molecular problems then become cellular problems, because then the cell doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And if the cell doesn't work the way it's supposed to, then it doesn't communicate with other cells, because cells in bodies like ours don't exist in isolation, but they exist as part of systems. Either tissues or organs or systems like our blood system. And those intercellular communications also get affected. So you get aging at every single level, but these levels are not separate. In fact, there's a lot of crosstalk both ways between these levels. And so you can think of aging as a very multifactorial problem involving a highly complex system that's organized at many different levels.
And the complexity brings me to this question around how today we've got everything from Instagram influencers, talking about biohacking, all the way to actually people spending billions of dollars into actual serious research on aging. Have you ever pondered the moral, ethical, social questions around this whole phenomenon?
Well, biohacking is interesting, because I think of those people as what some people dismissively call the worried well, because these are very well-off people. There's usually nothing wrong with them, but they're somehow terrified of things becoming worse, of declining, and so they use any little scientific information. Sometimes it's pseudoscience, sometimes it has a scientific basis, but it's not really ready to be used in humans. And they will experiment with themselves in a desperate way to try and stay young. I think they're somehow missing the point of living. They're forgetting that life is about other things, enjoying life and music and, friends and family and so on. But anyway, it's a sort of growing trend among some of these well-off people. And I hear that even in Bangalore, there are a lot of these biohackers around. Maybe they're in the audience as well, in which case, I apologize. But anyway, I'm not sure what there's no question in my mind that science is going to come up with ways to keep you a bit healthier as you age by tackling some of these fundamental processes of aging. Now, if it does that without increasing longevity, then nobody will complain. It means we'll live very healthily and then suddenly, drop dead, in a few days. Actually, my dad cooked an elaborate dinner, about 4 weeks ago, and then 3 days later he declined and died. Now, that's the kind of life that most of us would aspire to. You're independent, you can do your stuff, and then you suddenly decline. But we don't know, and nobody really knows, at least I'm not convinced, that you can improve health span, which is the period of life that you're healthy, without also increasing lifespan. So maybe we'll be postponing that inevitable decline. And if we do that, what we're doing is we're increasing lifespan as a society. And then the question is, if people are living longer and longer, what does this mean for society? What does it mean for generational fairness, for intergenerational turnover? You'll have the same people, in power, not quitting. You can imagine, 20 years from now, another Biden versus Trump election. At least Biden had the good sense to drop out, but you can just imagine this going on and on forever. So I think that we have not really talked about the social consequences of a very long-lived society.
In fact, the final, I think, couple of chapters of your book do sort of look into some of these questions, almost at a philosophical level. And you have a line there where you say, it may be simpler to accept that our life is limited. So it's interesting that, at the end of it, that's...
Yeah. The thing that occurs to me is that we already live twice as long on average as people did 150 years ago. And, people are still not happy. We say, well, why do we have to die in our 80s? Why can't we live 150? So my guess is that if we live to be 150, then people will be saying, wait a minute, why should we die at 150? Why don't we live for 300 years? And so this quest is an eternal, quest. It's not going to ever be satisfied. And the other problem is that as we live longer and longer, you will die of other reasons than aging. You will die of infectious disease. Maybe they will cure cancer, but I doubt it. It's also a highly multifactorial disease. But you'll die of other things. And nobody has actually figured out how to stop aging in the brain or how to prevent dementia. That's a big unsolved problem in science. So unless they solve that, you might get the situation where we're continuing to live and then we all end up getting neurodegenerative diseases. So I think there are real issues here. And, I was speaking actually to an Indian linguist, Ganesh Devi, who many of you may know because he used to be associated with NCBS. And I actually mention him in the book. And, his idea was, well, we just have to accept this as part of life. We have to think of ourselves as part of life as a whole rather than as an individual. And it occurs to me that just as cells in our body die all the time, and we're not even aware of it, our body keeps going, in the same way individuals may die, but life on earth and societies will keep going. So that's a philosophical view. But of course, the flip side is we have deeply evolved to not want to die, okay? And there's an old joke about who would want to live to be 100, and the answer is somebody who's 99. And so, I think that if somebody were to come to you with a pill and said, look, we've developed a new pill, it has no side effects, and it'll give you 10 years of extra healthy life. Okay, nobody wants to be sick for another 10 years, but let's say it gives you 10 years of extra healthy life. Almost all of us would take it. In fact, one reason I'm taking statins and blood pressure medicines is in the hope that I'll stay healthy as I age and won't get a stroke or a heart attack or something like that. So we're all programmed to do that. But what's good for the individual is not necessarily what's good for society. And we see that in all sorts of different fields. You see that in urban planning, in our use of energy. We all, people like to drive around in their cars, even though it's bad for the planet. I flew in from London to Bangalore. It's not a very good thing for the planet. So people will make individual choices that they like, even though it's not good for society. And I'm sure that when it comes to longevity, it'll be the same problem, the same dilemma.
I'm glad you brought up the pill, because another point you make is that instead of looking for this magic pill that will solve all of these issues, there is some value in those old-fashioned ideas that you eat moderately, you exercise. Those things actually do add to the quality of your life.
Yeah, so currently there's a lot of efforts to develop various kinds of therapeutics. But the thing is that all of the science now shows that some very old advice actually works. And that we now understand why they work. And the three things that I point out in the book are diet, having a moderate diet, and preferably with plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables, and a healthy exercise. And I would say exercise that is both cardiovascular, like running or cycling or swimming, but also weight training, because we also suffer from muscle loss as we get older, and weight training can slow down that decline. And exercise has all sorts of effects at the physiological level, at the cellular level. For example, regeneration of mitochondria is improved with exercise. And so there are many benefits to exercise. And the final thing is sleep. It turns out sleep is not something that's just done by mammals. It's done by almost every species. Even unicellular organisms have a circadian rhythm, which is the equivalent of sleep. And so what happens in sleep is different in complex animals. Many of these repair pathways are turned on. So all of the repair of the wear and tear and regeneration occurs in the sleep phase. And so if you don't sleep, you age faster, but you're also prone to many other diseases. In fact, it's astonishing the number of diseases that you're at risk at if you are sleep deprived. So those are three important things. And I would say, apart from that, there are other things you could do. Some of the things you can do are get checked for diabetes, especially in India, because Indians are prone to be diabetic. And that involves, by the way, both a lifestyle and a diet change, but it's also a genetic component. But diabetes is very treatable, and especially when detected early. And the other is to detect for high blood pressure, which can also be a silent killer, and of course for cholesterol and lipid profile. All of these are very cheap and easily detectable and cheap to treat. And they can also help you with your health in old age. And there are two social aspects to aging that I didn't quite emphasize enough in the book. And one is that people have found that social isolation is bad for your health. It's actually bad at all ages, but it's also particularly bad when you're elderly. And this idea of shoving away old people in retirement homes and having them live isolated lives is not a good idea. And so you need to make sure that older people are socially, have a good social network. Some of these retirement homes actually have a good social network within them. But I also believe that it's best integrated, have generational integration in society. That's just my personal view. And the other thing is having a sense of purpose is apparently very good for longevity. And, people who are older, they may not be able to do the jobs that they did when they were young, but they can do other things. They can help, they can do volunteer work, they can help with the community, they can do all sorts of things, which gives them a sense of purpose in life. And so there are a number of things we can do to try and stay healthy, and also it makes life more enjoyable.
And you're big on exercise as well. I believe you cycle a lot.
I cycle a lot. I could be doing more exercise and eating less, and but there we are.
So we're running out of time, but I'll ask one final question which we weren't able to cover earlier. Another thing I loved about the book is just the number of stories of scientists who been able to make progress in this field, and often because of luck, sometimes because of chance, accidents, and all of that. Just tell us a little bit about this. There's this one anecdote about a gentleman who stored some very dangerous bacteria next to the ice cream in his fridge, and how that ended up eventually sort of, helping him when he next moved. And
yeah, this is about the discovery of a major pathway in the cell that's responsible for sensing nutrients and keeping protein synthesis turned on. And when it's inhibited, that same pathway, so it's a pathway that's affected by caloric restriction. So it turns out that if you reduce the number of calories that you eat, you actually age more slowly. And of course, this has some consequences. But anyway, that's a finding that's been true in lots of species. And one of the major pathways affected by restricting your caloric intake is called the TOR pathway. Now, the TOR pathway was discovered in a very complicated series of coincidences. So a group of Canadian scientists went to Easter Island looking for microbial soil microbes that produced maybe antibiotic compounds. And because many antibiotics come from soil microbes. And so they went to Easter Island, they isolated a bunch of soil samples, and from one of these samples, they found a strain of bacteria that produced a compound that killed yeast and other fungi. And so this was thought, well, maybe it'll be useful as a fungicide because fungal infections are hard to treat. But then this compound turned out to have anti-tumor properties. So then it became interesting for anti-cancer. And the company, this was all done at a Canadian company, and that company was going to merge with an American company called Wyeth. And the guy who was working on this bacterium that produced this compound called rapamycin, because Rapa Nui was the name for Easter Island. So this guy wanted to work on rapamycin, but because they were moving, people had essentially wanted to close down the project. But he was unwilling to give it up, so he grew up a huge batch of bacteria and froze the bacterial paste in an ice cream carton and kept it in his freezer at home with a label marked "Don't Eat." And then he took it with him to the US. Of course, this was probably before 9/11, because you couldn't get across the Canadian-US border with a ice cream carton full of bacteria now. But anyway, he did that. And then he convinced his new bosses this was worth working on. And what they found was that it was an immunosuppressive drug. And it became an FDA-approved drug for organ transplant recipients, so to prevent rejection of the graft. And so it had commercial value, but nobody knew how it worked. And then 2 Americans and an Indian working in Switzerland figured out, using yeast genetics, what the target of rapamycin was. And so the name TOR comes from target of rapamycin. And so this pathway turns out to be a major pathway, and it's very likely, Michael Hall has won major awards like the Lasker Prize and so on. So it's one of these big discoveries in biology. And now it turns out that rapamycin, because it mimics caloric restriction in some ways, not in every way, obviously, it has some of the same effects as caloric restriction. So aging scientists are now wondering whether rapamycin could be used to, increase longevity and increase health in old age. But of course, rapamycin is also an immunosuppressant, which means it makes you more prone to infections. And so nothing is completely free of side effects. But it just shows you how you can go from a completely independent, really basic research to something that has consequences for aging.
There's always a trade-off. I know we promised 15 minutes for questions. We've only got about 8. If you can raise your hands, I'm sure someone will move a mic around. Please keep your questions brief, and please make sure they're questions and not statements.
Yeah, and I'd appreciate it if you spoke loudly and slowly, because I have hearing aids, and with all the echo, it's going to be hard for me to hear otherwise.
Where's the mic? Oh, yeah.
Hello, sir. Do you, from a technical point of view, what is the impact of cryo-freezing a human? Would that increase longevity? What kind of effect does that have?
Yeah, to me, this cryonics has about the same effect as mummifying the pharaohs in Egypt. Okay, it's the modern equivalent of mummification of the pharaohs in Egypt, because if you take your favorite fruit and put it in the freezer and then thaw it out, what are you going to get? You're not going to get that nice fresh fruit. You're going to get this horrible mush. And my feeling is these guys, they inject some sort of antifreeze into the body as soon as it's died. And then they expect that when they freeze it and thaw it, they're somehow going to be able to revive the person. And I think there's absolutely no evidence for it. I won't say anything more strongly because I don't want to be sued by these people. But if I say there's no evidence for it, you can understand what I think of it. Okay?
Yeah, can I ask the question right back here?
Where are you? Stand
here.
up.
Here
There.
at the back, yeah. Concerning the topic of why we die, is there anything that we can do about increasing death education and death awareness so that we build that empathy within ourselves, knowing that death is a certainty, and we go towards it with much more grace? I mean, is there something that we can do?
There might be, but we've had this problem for many thousands of years, probably maybe even over 1 million years, because we've been aware of death. And so there's been plenty of opportunity for humans to deal with death. And I would argue that many religions, one of their purposes is to allow humans to cope with death. So I'm not sure what we can do, but what we can do is somehow integrate older people better into the community, make sure that their needs are met. For example, older people might find it harder to go shopping. There are ways that you can do to, make stores available, have services for them. So there are many things we can do to help the elderly in our society. But I'm not sure we can go much beyond that in terms of coping with death. I think people have to accept it. But I think, as I said, we're sort of programmed almost evolutionarily not to want to die. And so that's going to be quite hard to get around.
You can
Hi,
speak,
sir.
and then there's a gentleman here who's waiting for a while, so I'd like the mic to go to him eventually. Yeah.
Sure. So, I am here. Considering it's not about human welfare anymore when it comes to any systems in the world, and it's all about commercialization of everything, including science, do you think any answers that science comes up with for life longevity will actually be good for humans, or will Big Pharma allow that to happen in the first place?
Well, I think you brought up an interesting question about commercialization. That's true in some countries, like the US especially. But it's perhaps not true in Britain. For example, we have a National Health Service. So if there were advances that are made, they would be available, presumably if they actually were worth it. In other words, they increased your quality of life and health. There's strict criteria for what will be funded by the NHS. But if those sorts of medicines became available, for example, statins or blood pressure medicines, I get them on the NHS. So that would be okay. The problem you mentioned, though, is that there's a lot of privatization of therapeutics and longevity. And if these treatments are very expensive, they will be available mainly to really rich people. And I should point out that even in countries like the UK with a health service, National Health Service, so that the cleaner in my building gets the same medical care as the director of the institute, okay? So even in Britain, the richest 10% live 15 years longer than the poorest 10%, okay? And in the US, it's even bigger. The margin, actually, it's 10 years in the UK, and it's 15 years in the US. And you can imagine this diverging if treatments become very expensive and not being available. And there is a joke in the aging community that the best way to live a long time is to be rich.
Hello.
Where are you?
Hello, one sec. Hello, I'm here in
Where?
front.
Oh,
Left.
Oh, there.
Okay.
Oh, right here. We
All
need
right.
more questions from the back. I'm sure there are people. Mic should be moving also a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, hello. All right. So my question is, like you mentioned that Emperor of China in his quest for immortality tried to fight Shangri-La and like, so there are two modern ways of supposed immortality, scientific. One is this, I don't know if you heard of this immortal jellyfish. And second is nanobots to infinitely repair damaged cells. So can you comment on these two supposed theoretical ways of immortality?
Yeah, the jellyfish is actually real, and it does it because it has stem cells. Stem cells are cells which regenerate, fully differentiated tissue, and so in a sense, a jellyfish is a little bit like a plant. Plants have stem cells distributed throughout, and this is one reason why you can take a cutting from a plant and grow an entirely new plant. And so jellyfish, the immortal jellyfish, has that plant-like quality of regeneration. That's not true for us, for mammals. So I'm not sure, although it's fascinating and a lot of biologists are interested, I personally am not sure how relevant that is to human biology. Because, the question is, how can you regenerate stem cells in humans? And that's a different question from how the jellyfish is. In terms of nanobots, I could, this is completely out of my expertise, but I could imagine that they could go in there and perhaps repair different kinds of damage. My sense is that's going to be more macroscopic damage rather than damage at the molecular and cellular level that causes aging.
Anyone at the back?
Yeah, I have a question.
Where? One last question. Okay, then it has to be from the back. This has been very. Where are you?
Yeah.
Can't see you.
Here,
Are they?
here.
Stand up.
I'm standing.
Are
Black
there?
shirt.
There you are.
Yes. So my question is regarding Ozempic. So have you heard of Ozempic? If yes, then what is it and how is it different from something like rapamycin?
Let me address that. So
Cool.
Ozempic belongs to a family of compounds called GLP-1, molecules. And it's one of the omissions in my book, because when I was writing the book, these compounds, these GLP-1-like compounds, they were thought to be mainly a treatment for extreme overweight, obesity, etc., and for weight loss, and with possible implications for diabetes. But it turns out that their effects are more widespread. And there is a feeling that they generally reduce inflammation and have other beneficial effects which may have implications for healthy aging. So it's a rapidly growing field, but of course we don't know yet what the very long-term effects are of using these GLP-1 like therapeutics. So I would say it's a legitimate area of research, but you need more work before it's used for things like aging in the normal population. I think if you're extremely overweight, there's no question that they have a significant benefit.